In the logging camp of Greystone Flats, a child was dragged through the mud by a man twice her size. Not a child exactly. She was perhaps 26 or 27, but she moved like someone who had forgotten she was allowed to take up space. Her wrists were lashed behind her with rough cord. Her coat had been torn at the shoulder, one sleeve hanging by a thread. Her dark hair was loose and wet, stuck across her face, and she could not push it away. The men standing along the bunkhouse row watched without moving. A few of them leaned on axe handles. One spat into the dirt near her boots. Nobody said her name. They had already decided what she was. The foreman, a wide-shouldered man named Rufus Crane, shoved her up onto the back of a flatbed wagon that served as a platform when the camp needed one. He had a voice like gravel in a tin pail, and he used all of it. "Good men of Greystone Flats, this woman stands before you accused of burning the company payroll office and leaving Superintendent Aldous Beckett dead inside it. She is a thief, a murderer, and company property until the magistrate arrives, which won't be before spring thaw. So we do what the company permits. Anyone willing to feed and house her in the meantime can claim the obligation. Whoever takes her takes responsibility. Speak now, or she goes in the lock shed till March." The lock shed was a windowless wood store beside the frozen creek. Everyone in camp knew what a winter in the lock shed meant. They also knew what it meant to claim a woman no one believed. No one spoke. At the edge of the crowd stood Hector Fenn, a timber cruiser who had come down from the high ridges above Wolverine Lake to collect his season's wages and resupply before the passes closed. He was 41 years old. He wore a canvas coat patched at both elbows and a wool hat pulled low against the November wind. His pack mule, a gray animal named Burl, waited at the hitching post outside the commissary with a load of traps, salt, and cartridges. Hector had planned to be back above the snow line before dark. He had heard the sound Crane was making before. He had heard it at his brother's inquest 8 years ago, when a mine supervisor had used that same reasonable-sounding voice to explain why a cave-in was the fault of the men inside it. When Crane called for takers a second time, the silence stretched. Then Hector walked forward. He did not say much. He handed Crane the folded wages he had just collected, 11 weeks of survey work, and said, "I'll take the obligation." Crane looked at the money, then he looked at Hector. The way men look at someone they've already decided is a fool. "You know what she's accused of, Fenn. I heard you the first time. You're spending good wages on a woman condemned." Hector looked at him steadily. "I'm spending them on the alternative to watching you lock her in a woodshed until March." The crowd was quiet in a different way now. Hector stepped up beside the wagon, drew his knife, and cut the cord from her wrists without looking at the crowd. She swayed when the tension released. He steadied her by the elbow, carefully, the way you'd steady something that had been pulled too tight for too long. He helped her down from the wagon. No one stopped him. No one helped her. He led her through the mud toward the hitching post where Burl waited, and every eye in Greystone Flats followed them out of camp. By morning, the whole flat would be talking about the timber cruiser who had spent his wages on a convicted woman whose name half of them didn't even know. Her name was Nessa Wark. Hector did not learn it until they had put 2 miles of spruce forest between themselves and the camp. He kept Burl moving at a walk and said nothing until the last sound of the camp had died behind the trees. Then he stopped beside a frozen creek crossing and turned to face her. "I'm going to untie the rest of this," he said, meaning the cord still wrapped around one wrist where he hadn't been able to reach the second knot in the cold. "I won't touch you otherwise. You set the pace from here." She watched him with the careful eyes of someone who had learned not to trust quickly, but she held out her wrist. He worked the knot loose with numb fingers and stepped back. She rubbed the skin where the cord had been. Her hands were bluish with cold. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, deciding something. "Nessa Wark," she said. "I didn't kill Aldous Beckett." Hector nodded once. He was not a man who made fast declarations of belief, but he had seen enough liars in his life. to know what they looked like. And this woman's voice, when she said it, carried the particular weight of someone who had repeated the truth so many times in a room full of people who refused to hear it, that the words had gone hollow with use. He set her on Burl and walked beside her through the rising cold. She didn't speak again for a long time. She sat on the mule with her torn coat pulled close, and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked straight ahead at the dark wall of timber, as if she were calculating whether the forest would be kinder to her than the camp had been. Hector walked beside her and let the silence be. His cabin sat above the north shore of Wolverine Lake, reached by a trail that climbed through old-growth fir and came out on a bench of open rock before descending to the water. By the time the roof appeared, through the trees, Nessa's lips were pale and her fingers had stopped moving. Hector got her inside and built up the stove without ceremony. He placed his rifle in the corner where she could see it was not in his hands. He moved around the small room with the economy of a man who lived alone and had no habits that required another person's attention. When the fire had taken hold, he set water on for tea and pulled a blanket from the chest by the wall. "Chair's warmer than the floor," he said. She sat. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and held the mug of tea in both hands, and for a long time she only stared at the stove. Hector sat across from her at the table and waited. "Aldous Beckett was my employer," she said finally. Her voice had evened out since the camp. Something in the warmth of the room had settled her breathing. He was also the man who kept the company's true accounts hidden, the ones that showed the logging contracts going to Prescott Hadley's investors instead of open tender. Hector said nothing. The name Prescott Hadley sat in the air of the cabin like smoke. Hadley owned half the timber rights above the 49th parallel. He owned the magistrate who was supposed to arrive in spring. He owned 2 of the 3 surveyors Hector had worked for 11 weeks. "I was Beckett's records clerk," Nessa continued. "I found the hidden ledger, by accident. The real one, with the payoffs to the Territorial Land Office, the names of the rangers who falsified stand surveys, the amount paid to the Crown Examiner to approve clear-cuts that were supposed to be protected watershed. And Beckett found out you'd seen it," Hector said. Nessa's hands tightened on the mug. He didn't shout. "I almost wish he had." He looked up from his desk and said, "Miss Wark, you are a careful woman. I hope you will continue to be careful." That was all. She paused. 3 days later, the payroll office burned. Beckett was found inside. His deputy told the camp I had been seen near the building before the fire started. "Were you?" "I brought Beckett his supper pail at 6 o'clock, as I did every evening. I was gone before 7. Her eyes were level on his face. "Someone needed a body found quickly and a woman to put beside it." The fire cracked between them. Outside, wind moved through the firs along the lakeshore. Hector looked at his hands on the table and thought about the surveyor's maps he had filed that season, and how many of them, now that he considered it, had come back from the land office with annotations he hadn't made. "The ledger," he said. "Where is it?" Nessa looked toward the dark window. Then she looked back at him. "I have it." Hector was quiet for a moment. "Then you know what finding us here will mean." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to carry my war, Mr. Fenn. I'm asking you not to send me back." Hector looked at the stove. He looked at his hands. He thought about his brother's inquest and the supervisor's reasonable voice, and the way a room full of decent people could decide that the simplest explanation was the one that cost them least. "You'll take the bed," he said at last. "I'll sleep by the door." He had meant to keep the arrangement at arm's length. Practical shelter, nothing more, until he could think through what the ledger meant and what could be done with it, before Prescott Hadley's magistrate arrived in spring. But a small space in winter has its own logic. 4 mornings after he'd brought her to the cabin, Hector came in from checking the trap line to find the wood box filled, the floor swept, and Nessa standing at the stove stirring a pot of oatmeal, with the calm efficiency of someone who had decided that being idle while someone else worked was not something she was able to do. The next day she mended the broken toggle on his snowshoes without being asked. By the end of the week, the cabin had a different quality to its silence. Not the silence of a man alone, but the silence of two people who had found they did not need to fill space with noise to justify each other's presence. Hector taught her what the winter required, how to pack a wound with clean snow before pressure, how to follow a marten track without overrunning it, how to hear the difference between a dead branch falling and a boot breaking crust, how to move through the trees without leaving a line a man on snowshoes could follow back. Nessa learned everything without pretending it was easy. She asked questions that were specific and sensible. She did not perform fear, but she did not hide it either, and there was something in that honesty that Hector had not expected to find restful. One evening he came in late from the far end of the lake and found her at the table with a small tintype photograph in her hand, the kind that sat in a brass frame. He had left it on the shelf above the window. She looked up quickly and moved to set it down, but he shook his head. "It's all right," he said. She looked at it again. A woman, dark-haired, standing in front of a painted backdrop in a city studio. "Your wife?" "Elsa," he said. He sat down across from her and looked at the photograph instead of at Nessa. "She was from New Brunswick. We had 4 years on this lake before the influenza came through." He said it the way you say the thing you have said so many times it no longer breaks your voice. "I told her the nearest doctor was close enough. I was wrong." Nessa held the tintype carefully, with both hands, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else's grief. "She looks like she knew her own mind." "She did," Hector said. And then, after a pause, "I've spent 6 years being right that silence was safer than trying again." Nessa set the photograph down gently and pushed it back toward the edge of the table, where it had been. She did not offer him comfort. She only nodded, as if she understood that some things don't need commentary to be heard. Hector stepped outside before dawn the next morning to check the weather. The lake was flat and white under a half-moon. He stood for a moment in the cold, listening. Then he saw the snowshoe tracks crossing the lower bench below the cabin. 2 sets. Coming from the direction of the Greystone Flats trail. Not old. He was back inside before the stove ticked twice. He pressed one finger to his lips and pointed to the trapdoor beneath the bunk. Nessa understood immediately. She was under the boards with the hidden ledger pressed against her chest before Hector had pulled his rifle from the corner. He set a kettle on the stove and opened the door before the knock came. 2 men stood in the pre-dawn dark. Both wore company tallyman coats. One of them had a brass pin on his lapel, a small image of a crossed saw and chain, the private mark of Hadley's land-clearing contractors. Hector had seen it twice before and had not forgotten what it meant. "Morning, Fen," the taller one said. "Heard you took on an obligation at the flats." Hector stood in the doorway. He did not open it wider. "I'm brewing tea. What can I do for you?" The man looked past him into the cabin, the stove, the single mug on the table, the bunk with the blanket pulled flat. Prescott Hadley reaches Millbrook Junction in 6 days. Once the land titles transfer and the spring cut orders go through, the territorial charter closes. Anyone inconvenient to that process will be dealt with. Before the circuit magistrate has a chance to hear inconvenient testimony. The second man smiled, the way men smile when the violence is theoretical and they haven't been asked to carry it themselves yet. "Company says the woman's already a liability. Says it'd be a kindness to settle her account before she causes more trouble." Below the boards, Nessa lay in the narrow crawl space, with her hand pressed over her mouth and heard every word. Her ribs hurt from breathing too carefully. Hector did not move from the doorway. He gave them nothing. No crack of light past the frame, no signal of where she was, no invitation to enter. He let the silence run long enough to make the decision for them. At last the taller man said, 6 days, Fen. After that, it won't matter." They turned back toward the trail. Hector stood in the open doorway until the last sound of their snowshoes had crossed the bench and gone quiet in the trees. Then he lifted the trapdoor. Nessa came up with frost on her coat, and the ledger tucked under her arm. She was shaking. Not from cold. 6 days, she said. Hector went to his pack on the wall hook. Millbrook Junction is 4 days from here through the high country if the weather holds. He began to sort what they would need. The territorial recorder's office is there. Not Hadley's man, the federal one. Nessa pulled the oilcloth package from inside her coat, the ledger wrapped tight as she had kept it since the night she had sewn it into the hem of her apron, and walked out of the Greystone Flats Records hut for the last time. She held it out to him. Her hands were steady. Hector looked at the package, and then at her. He thought about 6 years of keeping himself too far north for any of it to reach him. He thought about the crossed saw pin on a company man's lapel, and how the same brass mark had appeared in the inquest papers his brother's widow had shown him 8 years ago, when they explained why no charges would be filed. He took the ledger. Then he began to pack. They left before first light, moving through the old fir, in single file, with burl-loaded light for the terrain ahead. Hector broke trail. Nessa followed in his prints, and carried the rifle across both arms the way he had shown her. Neither of them spoke about what was behind them. They spoke about the trail, ice patches, wind direction, where the creek crossings would be open, and where they would have to go around. When Burl stopped and shook his ears at nothing, they stopped too and stood still in the trees, listening, both of them. The high country above Wolverine Lake was a landscape of limestone ridges and frozen blowdowns, where the wind came in sideways and the trees bent permanently away from it. There were no trails marked on any company map. Hector knew the ground because he had walked it alone for 6 years and had no reason to hide which way he went. Now he used that knowledge differently, choosing routes that a man on snowshoes following tracks could not anticipate, cutting back through rock where the wind would clean the surface, crossing open snow, only where the angle would confuse a bearing. On the second night, they sheltered in a natural rock alcove above the timber line, out of the wind but not out of the cold. Hector built a fire well back inside the stone, where no light would carry downslope. Nessa sat close to the flame and watched his hands move, sorting kindling with a steadiness that wasn't hiding anything. "You're not sleeping," she said. "I'll sleep in shifts." She looked at him across the fire. "Why did you pay 11 weeks of wages for a woman you'd never met?" Hector considered this for a long time before answering. "Because the last time I stood in a crowd and did nothing, I spent 8 years carrying it." He looked into the fire. "My brother went into a mine that his foreman knew was unsound. I was in the room when the foreman said it was safe. I had a survey that said otherwise. I didn't speak." He paused. Elsa would have. She was better at that than I was. The fire shifted between them. Nessa looked at the flame for a while without speaking. "The men they hired to burn that office," she said quietly, "they're not just company men. The records in that ledger show payments to 2 territorial rangers and a Crown survey inspector. If Hadley's charter closes, those payments disappear into the transfer documents, and 3 protected watersheds north of the 52nd parallel become clear-cut timber licenses." She looked at him. "This isn't just about what happened to me." "No," Hector said. "I know." Above them, wind moved over the limestone in long, cold pulls. Somewhere below the ridge, in the dark, snow slid from a heavy branch and fell without sound. "You said your wife was better at speaking than you," Nessa said. "You've spoken twice since Greystone Flats, once when it cost you 11 weeks of wages, and once just now." She looked at him steadily. "I think you've been selling yourself short for 6 years." Hector looked at her across the small fire. He did not answer, but something that had been braced against itself inside him shifted a fraction and did not go back to where it had been. They came over the last ridge above Millbrook Junction on the morning of the 4th day. Smoke from 100 chimneys hung in the cold air below them. The sound of bells from a stone church carried faintly up through the cold. Nessa stopped at the top of the ridge. she had held up through 4 days of hard country, 2 nights of temperatures that drove the cold. Under every layer, a creek crossing where the ice gave without warning, and she had gone into the knee before Hector caught her arm, and 40 miles of silence, where the only company was the sound of her own breathing, and the knowledge that men were somewhere behind her, who had decided she was already dead. She stood on the ridge, and her knees shook with effort she had been too busy to feel, until now. Hector stopped beside her. He did not say anything. He stood next to her until the shaking passed. "Ready?" he said. She straightened. "Yes." They came down the main street of Millbrook Junction with Hector's arm taking some of her weight on the last slope where the path was iced beneath the fresh snow. People on the boardwalk stopped to watch. A woman in a gray coat put her hand over her mouth. A man pointed. Then someone near the harness shop said, loudly enough for the street to hear, "That's the work woman. They said she was dead." Nessa did not stop. She helped Hector to the steps of the Federal Land Office, which sat beside the assay building on the north end of the main street. He was limping slightly. A fall on the second day's descent had wrenched his knee, and he had said nothing about it for 40 miles. She noticed now, and said nothing about that either. They leaned together against the railing while she caught her breath, and then she climbed the steps and pushed open the door. The Federal Land Recorder was a small, careful man named Theodore Price. He looked up from his desk at the woman in the torn coat and the man with the wrenched knee and the oilcloth package laid on his desk, and he did not immediately reach for it. "Miss Wark," he said, and then stopped. "You know my name," Nessa said. "There's a company notice." He looked at Hector. "And you're Hector Fenn, survey contractor, Wolverine District." He paused. "There's a notice for you now, too." Hector leaned on the desk. "There's a federal charter transfer scheduled in 2 days. Prescott Hadley, territorial land acquisition, north of the 52nd. I'm aware of it. Open that package before you sign anything." Price looked at the oilcloth. He looked at Nessa. She held his gaze without blinking and without asking. After a moment, he reached for the package and untied the cord. Inside was a ledger, water-stained at the corners but intact, with columns of figures in Aldous Beckett's precise hand, and a second column in a different hand. Prescott Hadley's land agent, Nessa knew, because she had filed enough of his correspondence to recognize his slant. Price opened it. He read without speaking. His face became very still, the way a face becomes still when it is working hard at not showing what it is seeing. Then he closed the ledger, placed both hands flat on top of it, and looked up at Nessa. "I need you to make a formal statement," he said. "Today, before Hadley's representatives arrive." "I know," Nessa said. "That's why I'm here." The hearing convened the following morning in the Millbrook Junction Community Hall, because the Federal Land Office was not large enough for the number of people who arrived. Prescott Hadley sat at the front of the room in a wool suit that had been pressed that morning. He was a compact, white-haired man, with the comfortable bearing of someone who had spent 40 years being right by definition. He looked at Nessa when she entered the room with the measured, sorrowful expression of a man confronting a sad and well-known problem. Hector stood at the back of the hall, his weight on his good leg, watching Hadley's hands on the edge of the table, and the federal commissioner's face, and the door, and the crowd. Nessa sat at the table across from Hadley, with her hands folded, her coat still torn at the shoulder, her dark hair pinned back with 2 sticks from the forest because she'd had nothing else. She had not slept. Neither had Hector. Exhaustion had a way of clarifying things, burning off the noise until only the essential was left. She testified first. She named the date of the fire. She named the time she had left Beckett's office, and the witness who had seen her return to the bunkhouse. A cookhouse assistant named Pearl Gruber, who had not been asked to testify at the camp inquiry, because no one at the camp inquiry had looked for her. The oilcloth ledger went onto the commissioner's table. Page by page, the recorder read entries aloud. Cash payments to 2 named territorial rangers, a cash payment to the Crown Survey Inspector listed under the notation Revised Watershed Classification Fee, and a final entry marked simply Clearing Costs, Greystone Flats Payroll Incident. The room was very quiet. Hadley waited through all of it, with his hands folded and his face set in patient sorrow. When the reading finished, he unfolded his hands and leaned forward slightly. "Gentlemen," he said, "and Commissioner, you are looking at the private records of Aldous Beckett, a man my company employed in good faith, who died in circumstances I have never fully understood. These entries reflect nothing that can be tied to my authorization. They reflect a clerk with access to funds and a troubled woman who, I am sorry to say, had formed an attachment to Beckett that he did not return." He looked at Nessa with something that managed to resemble genuine regret. "I have tried to extend charity where a harder man would have pressed charges." A murmur moved through the room. Some faces turned toward Hadley, with the involuntary softening that a well-delivered speech produces in people who want to believe the comfortable version. Nessa felt the weight of it. The same weight she had felt in Greystone Flats, the crowd's desire for the simpler story. Hadley's voice grew quieter and more certain. "This woman has been sheltered and influenced by a man with documented grievances against my operations. A surveyor dismissed for insubordinate conduct, who has carried a private bitterness about land acquisitions for years. I ask the Commissioner to consider what is more likely, a conspiracy reaching into my personal records, or a desperate woman and a bitter man building a case from a dead employee's notations." The Commissioner looked troubled. Hector watched two men in the front row exchange a glance that he recognized. The room was leaning. Then Hector pushed off from the wall. His knee hurt. He walked with an uneven step, and he did not try to hide it. He came up beside the table and addressed the Commissioner directly in a voice that carried without effort. "I surveyed the North Watershed stands last season," he said. "Every stand above the 52nd parallel. I filed my reports to the Territorial Land Office in September. 3 of my surveys came back with revised notations I didn't write, reclassifying protected old growth as accessible timber." He reached into his coat and laid 3 folded survey sheets on the table beside the ledger. "The revised notations are in the same handwriting as the land agent's column in that ledger." Theodore Price stepped forward and placed a second document beside the surveys. It was a receipt, time-stamped from the Territorial Land Office's incoming records. The original surveys, unfalsified, logged the day before the revisions had appeared. "Someone had access to filed government documents," Hector said. "Someone made changes after the fact, and the handwriting on those changes matches a column of figures in a ledger that Prescott Hadley is claiming he never controlled." A different silence entered the room. Hadley straightened very slightly. Just his shoulders. The sorrow on his face tightened into something more careful. The Commissioner looked from the surveys to the ledger to the receipt. He looked at Price. He looked at Hadley. Then the hall door opened. A young woman stepped inside, unwinding a scarf from her face. She was pink-cheeked from the cold and visibly frightened. But she walked forward without stopping and came to stand at the table without being asked. "My name is Pearl Gruber," she said. "I worked the cookhouse at Greystone Flats. I saw Nessa Wark come back to the bunkhouse at 10 minutes past 7 on the night of the fire. I know because I had just taken the bread out of the second oven, and I looked at the clock." She swallowed hard. "No one asked me about this because the deputy told the camp that the inquiry was finished before I could get to the records hut. When I tried to send word to the territorial office, my letter was returned unopened." She looked at Nessa. "I should have tried harder. I'm sorry I didn't." Hadley got to his feet. His voice had lost its sorrow. "This woman was coached. This testimony was arranged. I will not stand here and watch a federal proceeding." "Sit down, Mr. Hadley," the Commissioner said. It was not a loud voice. It did not need to be. Hadley sat. The Commissioner called for the territorial rangers named in the ledger to be detained pending review. He suspended the charter transfer. He ordered a full audit of the Land Office survey files for the previous 3 years. Prescott Hadley was arrested in the Millbrook Junction Community Hall before the morning was out. In front of 63 witnesses, the land agent was arrested at the train station. 2 hours later, 1 foot on the steps of the departing southbound. The false charges against Nessa Wark were dismissed. She stood in the hall doorway afterward, while the commissioner's men cleared the room, and she held the oilcloth package in both hands. Empty now, the ledger on the Federal record, and she looked at the gray sky above the main street of Millbrook Junction, the way you look at a thing you were not certain you would live to see. Pearl Gruber stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. "How did you know where to go?" Nessa asked. "Mr. Price sent word to the camp through a ranger who wasn't on Hadley's list," Pearl said. "I had to walk the last 11 miles on the ice road." She said it without complaint, as a simple fact of what it had cost and what it had been worth. In the days that followed, Hector's knee was seen to by a doctor on Church Street, who told him he would walk fine in a week if he stayed off the high country. Hector stayed at the Millbrook Junction Hotel. He walked badly for 4 days and then less badly, and then on the 5th morning, without the limp, Nessa could have left. With the charges dismissed and the federal process underway, there was nothing keeping her in Millbrook Junction. She had a sister in Ontario, a trunk of belongings still locked in the records hut at Greystone Flats, and a modest sum in wages owing to her from a company that would spend the next 6 months in federal audit. She could have gone south on the first train. She did not go south on the first train. On the morning of Hector's 5th day in Millbrook Junction, she found him outside the hotel, testing his weight on the recovered knee, looking north toward the line of mountains above the timber. She stood beside him and looked at the same mountains. "You'll go back," she said. It was not a question. "In a week," he said, "when the knee allows. The cabin needs the south-facing shutter rehung," she said. "I notice the hinge is cracked." Hector looked at her. She looked at the mountains. "I'm not asking to be kept," she said quietly. "I spent 3 years being Beckett's Records clerk and 2 weeks being Greystone Flats convicted woman, and I have had enough of being defined by what I am in relation to someone else's circumstances." She paused. "But there is work above Wolverine Lake that a person with record-keeping skills and a working knowledge of watershed surveys could do. Federal work, as it happens, if Theodore Price has anything to say about it." She glanced at him. "I'm told there's a surveyor in that district who might need a partner who can read a ledger without flinching." Hector looked at the mountains for a long time. He thought about the cabin above the lake and how it had felt different in the week she was in it. He thought about Elsa's tintype on the shelf and how Nessa had held it with both hands. He thought about 6 years of right answers and the way that being right about silence had not, in the end, made anything better. "The hinge will need a new pin," he said. "I don't have a spare at the cabin." "There's a hardware on the south end of the main street," Nessa said. "I checked." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he hadn't let himself in the cabin or on the trail or in the hall, because there had always been a reason not to. What he saw was not what Greystone Flats had tried to make her. It was not the woman on the wagon. It was not the frightened person under the floorboards. It was the woman who had carried a ledger for 4 days through the high country, shot a rifle she'd learned to use in 5 lessons, kept a fever patient alive on snowmelt and trapped rabbit, and walked into a federal hearing in a coat torn at the shoulder and 2 sticks in her hair and said what she needed to say. "The hardware opens at 8, he said. "I know," she said. "I'll meet you there." They did not rush what came after. The North Country does not encourage rushing. It encourages doing things correctly the first time before the weather closes. They worked through that winter, and the following spring on a federal water survey commission that Theodore Price had assembled with quiet satisfaction, as if he had always known that something useful would come from the trouble at Greystone Flats. The survey took them across 3 districts and 2 mountain ranges. Nessa kept the records. Hector walked records. Hector walked the ground. Between them, they produced the most detailed and accurate catalog of protected watershed stands in the territory's history. Millbrook Junction did not forget them. Pearl Gruber stayed on in town and opened a small cookhouse of her own on the east side of the main street, the kind of place where the coffee was always ready and the price was the same, whether you arrived in a company coat or a patched canvas one. She sent them bread each time they came through, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The camp at Greystone Flats was broken up by the federal audit and reorganized under a new foreman, who asked among his first questions whether anyone had witnessed the payroll office fire directly. It was a small thing and a late one, but it mattered. Hector rehinged the south shutter on the cabin above Wolverine Lake in early April in good light, with a new hinge pin from the Millbrook Junction hardware. Nessa held the shutter level while he drove the pin. They had learned by then that this was the most efficient way to do most things. One person steady, one person driving, and that it did not much matter which of them did which, as long as they decided together. Above the cabin door, where the light hit the wood, in the late afternoon, Hector nailed the cracked brass bell he had taken from the Greystone Flats auction wagon. The bell Rufus Crane had rung to sell a woman for 11 weeks of wages. He had carried it out of the camp in his coat pocket and said nothing about it until now. Nessa looked at it for a long time. "Not as a price," he said. "No," she agreed. It hung there above the door through every season after that, not as the record of what had been paid for her, but as the reminder of what it had cost two people to choose differently than the crowd, and what that choice, made quietly and without ceremony, in the mud of a logging camp on a November morning, had turned out to be worth.